Most soldiers who ship out for the Pacific War pack for heat, light uniforms, mosquito netting, gear built for jungle warfare, and coral sand beaches. In April 1943, the men of the U.S. 7th Infantry Division did exactly that, because almost none of them had been told where they were actually going. What they got instead was fog, so thick naval gunfire couldn't find its targets, wind gusts strong enough to knock a man off his feet, temperatures that turned wet boots into frostbite within hours, and 19 days of fighting against an entrenched Japanese garrison on a barren, treeless island in the Aleutians. This is the story of the Battle of Attu, the only land battle of the Second World War fought on incorporated United States territory, and one of the most costly in terms of casualties relative to the number of men engaged of the entire Pacific War. Attu sits at the far western tip of Alaska's Aleutian island chain, closer to Japan than to the American mainland, a barren stretch of tundra, bog, and steep volcanic ridges with no trees and almost no natural cover. Japan occupied it, along with the neighboring island of Kiska, in June 1942, in an operation most historians now understand as a diversion tied to the same campaign that led to Japan's catastrophic defeat at Midway, seize a foothold on American soil, however remote and strategically marginal, and force the United States to divide its attention and resources at exactly the moment its main fleet was engaged elsewhere in the Pacific. It worked in the narrow sense that the United States couldn't simply ignore Japanese troops occupying American territory, however far from anywhere that territory happened to be. Japanese planners also saw genuine strategic value in the islands themselves, sitting as they did along a stretch of ocean that could, in theory, control shipping lanes across the entire northern Pacific and offer a base for reconnaissance or even bomber operations aimed at the American Pacific Northwest. The island's small native Alaskan population, the Unangaks, sometimes called Aleuts, were taken prisoner by the occupying Japanese and shipped to a camp near Otaru on the Japanese island of Hokkaido, where 16 of the 42 captives died before the war's end, a human cost of the occupation that received almost no attention at the time and little more in the decades since. For nearly a year, retaking Attu and Kiska sat low on the list of American priorities, overshadowed by the far larger campaigns unfolding in the Solomons and New Guinea. When the operation to retake Attu, codenamed Land Crab, was finally approved for May 1943, American intelligence badly underestimated what was waiting there. Early estimates put the Japanese garrison at around 500 men. By the time the invasion force actually sailed, revised figures put the real number closer to 2,600, dug in under the command of a colonel named Yasuyo Yamasaki, who had arrived by submarine only a month earlier with no illusions about his situation. He'd been told plainly not to expect reinforcements, at least not before the end of May. The U.S. 7th Infantry Division, assigned to spearhead the assault, had spent its recent training cycle at Fort Ord in California, preparing for an entirely different kind of war altogether. Most of the men in the division genuinely believed they were headed for the South Pacific, an assumption reinforced by logistics officers who requisitioned mosquito netting and lightweight tropical uniforms for a force that was, in fact, about to fight in near-Arctic conditions thousands of miles from any jungle. The invasion force left San Francisco on April 24, 1943, and only as the convoy turned west toward the Aleutians did the truth of where they were headed start to sink in, along with the cold, damp fog of the Bering Sea. The landing, originally scheduled for May 7th, was delayed 4 days by bad weather, a delay that turned out to work in the Americans' favor, since the Japanese garrison had prepared for an attack on the 7th and had relaxed its guard by the time the invasion force actually arrived on May 11th. In the pre-dawn darkness, roughly 250 men of a provisional scout battalion paddled ashore from rubber boats launched by the submarines Narwhal and Nautilus, followed by the main landings at Holtz Bay in the north and Massacre Bay in the south. The beaches themselves were undefended. Yamasaki had already withdrawn his forces from the shoreline entirely, choosing instead to dig in on the high ground overlooking the landing zones, a defense-in-depth strategy that would later be repeated at far larger scale on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. What followed was a battle fought as much against the terrain and the weather as against the Japanese defenders themselves. Snow-covered peaks rose nearly 3,000 feet above the landing beaches. Thick fog rendered naval and artillery bombardment largely useless, since gunners often couldn't see the positions they were meant to be hitting, while that same fog gave Japanese snipers, dug into caves and crevasses along the ridgelines, perfect concealment to pick off American soldiers as they emerged above the cloud line. Sudden, violent gusts of wind, known locally as willywaws, could knock an unprepared man flat without warning, adding one more hazard to terrain that was already treacherous enough on its own. Vehicles couldn't operate on the spongy tundra, meaning supplies and reinforcements had to be manhandled forward on foot across broken, boggy ground. Cold-weather gear that should have been issued before the operation had, in many cases, never arrived at all, and soldiers who spent hours or days soaked through in freezing wind began suffering frostbite and exposure injuries in numbers that, by some accounts, exceeded the toll from actual combat. Within days, exhaustion, cold injuries, and the sheer grinding difficulty of advancing through fog-shrouded mountain terrain against snipers who were nearly invisible until they fired, had ground the American advance down to a crawl. By May 15th, exhaustion had become severe enough that rumors of open mutiny began circulating among some units, quelled the following day when Brigadier General Eugene Landrum arrived to take over battlefield command from Major General Albert Brown, whose more cautious, methodical approach had frustrated superiors watching the campaign's slow progress from further up the chain of command. Slowly, over the following 10 days, American forces ground their way up through the ridgelines, Fishhook, Buffalo, and Engineer Hill among them, squeezing Yamasaki's shrinking force back toward Chichagof Harbor on the island's northern coast, with nowhere left to retreat to but the sea. That advance came at a steady cost in individual acts of desperate courage against entrenched positions that fog and terrain made almost impossible to spot until soldiers were already exposed in front of them. Private Joseph Martinez, a rifleman with the 32nd Infantry, earned a posthumous Medal of Honor during this stretch of the fighting for repeatedly charging forward alone against Japanese positions, holding up his unit's advance, clearing trench after trench under direct fire before he was finally killed. One of several such individual actions that, added together, were what grinding up the ridgelines actually meant on the ground. Briefly, in the third week of May, it looked as though Japan might actually attempt to break the siege from outside. On May 21st and 22nd, a powerful Imperial Japanese Navy task force assembled in Tokyo Bay, specifically to sortie toward Attu and relieve Yamasaki's garrison. A fleet built around 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships including the massive Musashi, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers substantial enough to threaten the entire American position in the North Pacific if it had actually sailed. It never got the chance. American forces closed in and effectively decided the battle before the relief fleet could depart, and the ships that might have changed the outcome entirely stayed in Tokyo Bay. By May 28th, Yamasaki's position had become hopeless in the most literal sense. He had roughly 800 men still fit to fight, and another 600 wounded, no reinforcements coming, and American forces controlling every piece of high ground around his shrinking pocket at Chichagof Harbor. Surrender, under the military culture he'd been raised in, was not a real option. He had, as he saw it, exactly 2 choices left: wait for the final American assault to annihilate what remained of his command, or attack first, on his own terms, and try to inflict as much damage as possible before the end came. He chose to attack. His plan targeted the weakest, thinnest stretch of the American line, between the Buffalo and Fishhook positions, timed for the middle of the night when American units would be least prepared. The objective was Engineer Hill, where American forces had stockpiled artillery, ammunition, and food. If Yamasaki's men could seize it, they might turn American guns against American lines before retreating into the mountains to regroup. At around 3:30 in the morning, on May 29, 1943, hundreds of Japanese soldiers surged forward in what became one of the largest banzai charges of the entire Pacific War. They struck Company B of the 32nd Infantry's 1st Battalion, men who had just come off the front line expecting nothing more dangerous that morning than a hot breakfast. Yamasaki's soldiers slashed and bayoneted their way through the thinly held position in the darkness. Wounded Americans were killed where they lay, and some survived only by lying still and pretending to already be dead as the charge swept past them. The breakthrough carried Japanese soldiers stunningly deep into what should have been secure American territory, far enough that stunned rear echelon troops, cooks, clerks, and support personnel who had never expected to see close combat found themselves fighting Japanese infantry hand-to-hand in the dark. Brigadier General Archibald Arnold scrambled together a scratch defense force from whatever units were nearby and capable of holding a rifle. Combat engineers from the 13th and 50th Engineer Battalions, medical personnel from the 7th Medical Battalion, headquarters staff, and even a handful of frostbitten soldiers who had been recovering in a field hospital tent moments earlier. That improvised line held. Slowly, as daylight came and organized American units converged on the breakthrough, the momentum of the charge broke, and what had briefly threatened to unravel the entire American position on the island instead became the final, catastrophic collapse of Yamasaki's command. Colonel Yamasaki himself was killed leading the charge from the very front, sword reportedly drawn as he urged his men onward. Behind the fighting at Chichagof Harbor, Japanese medical staff had already made a decision that captures, as starkly as anything from the entire battle, what no surrender actually meant in practice. Rather than leave wounded patients to be captured, doctors and orderlies euthanized them in the field hospital before the final assault began. A Japanese army surgeon, Dr. Nebu Tatsuguchi, recorded the decision in a diary later recovered from his body, along with a final farewell to his wife, written the night before the charge that would kill him. Most of the Japanese soldiers who survived the initial fighting chose suicide by grenade over capture in the hours that followed, consistent with a military culture that treated surrender as a dishonor worse than death. When it was over, American burial teams counted 2,351 Japanese dead on the island, a number that historians believe likely undercounts the true total, since an unknown additional figure were probably buried or destroyed entirely by the bombardment that preceded the final weeks of fighting. Small, isolated pockets of Japanese stragglers continued to be hunted down for weeks afterward, with more than 60 found and eliminated on May 30th alone, and reports of a handful of survivors holding out in the island's caves and hills, persisting as late as September. Only 28 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner out of a garrison that had numbered close to 2,600 at the battle's start, and not one of the 28 was an officer. It was, by any measure, one of the most complete annihilations of a defending force in the entire Pacific War. American losses across 19 days of fighting came to roughly 549 killed and well over 1,000 wounded. Casualty figures that, relative to the size of the forces actually engaged, made Attu one of the costliest battles the United States fought anywhere in the Pacific, a distinction usually associated only with far larger, far better remembered battles like Iwo Jima. What came next was almost anticlimactic by comparison. American and Canadian planners, assuming Kiska would require an equally brutal fight given what Attu had just cost, assembled an invasion force of more than 34,000 troops and launched a massive, carefully rehearsed amphibious assault on August 15, 1943. They found the island empty. Japan had secretly evacuated the entire Kiska garrison by ship in dense fog roughly 2 weeks earlier, slipping away entirely undetected. The Allied invasion force, moving cautiously through fog and expecting fierce resistance that was never actually going to come, suffered a number of friendly fire casualties and mine-related losses fighting an enemy that had already gone home. The Aleutian campaign has been called, by more than one historian, the forgotten battle of the Second World War, overshadowed almost from the moment it ended by the far larger campaigns unfolding simultaneously across the Pacific and within weeks in Europe. Even the campaign's own official record reflected how quickly it faded from national attention. The novelist Dashiell Hammett, serving as an Army sergeant stationed in the Aleutians, co-authored the military's own history of the campaign for a small readership of fellow servicemen, a modest document that stood in sharp contrast to the wall-to-wall newspaper coverage devoted to battles like Guadalcanal happening at the same time. For the Attu Unangaks, the war's end brought no real homecoming at all. The United States military judged rebuilding the remote, devastated island too costly to be worthwhile, and the surviving villagers, already reduced by their years in Japanese captivity, were permanently relocated to Atka Island, roughly 200 miles away, never permitted to return to the only home most of them had ever known. The last surviving member of that original Attu community died in 2023, 80 years after the battle that ended her people's presence on the island for good. If you want to hear the story of Guadalcanal, unfolding in the tropical Pacific at almost exactly the same time this frozen battle was being fought and forgotten, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.